Hi, my beloved Blee Block. It's Dr. Weeman, and as you probably figured out, I'm not with you today. I am taking my daughter, who's a senior, to a college interview in South Carolina. So I am traveling on the road. So say a bit of a prayer for her and for us as we go there and back. But I wanted to make sure that we kind of keep moving forward because I know we've all been pretty excited to get to the New Testament. And I just wanted to do the background for that with you today. So, right now, you may want to hit pause so that you can get your notebook and your pen or pencil out. If you're typing, you can set up your dual screen. But go ahead and hit pause, get those things. Make sure that you have dated your notebook with the correct date, and the title of your lecture is The World in the New Testament. So as you may have guessed, we're just going to do a bit of a background, excuse me, a little bit of background for the environment that these materials were produced in. And some of this you've been preparing for the last couple months, last 4 months or so. And so I'm going to try to cover a bit of that stuff for you today and set you up for understanding first century Roman Empire and going forward. Yay! Okay, so let's just jump right on in. So, the world of the New Testament, the era that these texts will emerge in is a time called Pax Romana. That's a Latin term for the Roman peace. And so from and I have the map here for you to see, if you take just kind of a look, I'm going to take the mouse. All this light green area, that is the Roman Empire. And they're pushing out, but by this time in the first century, that push is starting to slow down. And from that macro bird's eye view, things look pretty good. Things are pretty stable in the empire. You know, we don't have quite the same amount of civil war. They're able to kind of hold the boundaries, all the kinds of markers that you would look for in a society or a civilization that marked that kind of stability. So the time period that we're looking at that covers the Pax Romana is about 50 CE to 100 CE. Okay. But as we've kind of learned in history, what looks like something from a big macro bird's eye point of view might not be if you drill down and you start to look at things. And as I say here, it's just not that simple. So while the empire might look really peaceful from up above, as it were, there are some places in the empire where things are not going well. And one of those places is Palestine. It's often in turmoil. And we've spent some time in the last couple of weeks really talking about why that is. And part of that is that, with the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of Israel as sovereignty, the loss of the temple, of course, the temple is going to be rebuilt. And we are now officially in what is known as the Second Temple period. Do make sure you write that down. So Pax Romana is also within Judaism, the Second Temple period. And this is just a side and quick reminder, always hit pause on this so that you can get your notes and things like that. You can always make Dr. Weeman be quiet so that you can catch up. So in that Pax Romana, there's been there's a larger period within the Judaic history. I'm going to do a little bit of that with you, but it's the Second Temple period. That's super important because all of those Jews, including Jesus, his family, all the apostles, Paul, the form of rites and rituals that they know and that they practice, even if they're part of the 5 million Jews by census data that are located all throughout the empire. Remember, you got about 1 million, which is still a pretty dense population in the area of Palestine. They are influenced by those Second Temple practices and rites. But you also just have quite the spectrum of Judaism and how they see or how they understand things being resolved, what the restoration, remember in our prophetic literature, the hopes, the oracles of hope and restoration, glorification, glory, those things run the spectrum of what that's going to look like. But most Jews did not want to be Roman subjects. Even after all these centuries, they very much uh, have an understanding of themselves as a sovereign people in a very particular relationship with their God. So part of their religious identity is also tied up in their political identity and vice versa. What's important to us as we begin our New Testament work is that that tension is in the background. And we're actually going to see that tension come to the foreground in the sacred text because, one of the biggest controversies in the New Testament materials is something called the Judaizer controversy. And this is in its heart a question of, does one have to convert to Judaism prior to becoming Christian, or can one simply convert to Christianity? And we'll look at the ins and outs of that. But part of the question there for people is the role of Judaism and how they understand who Jesus is, particularly in terms of the messianic fulfillment that they're looking for. So we'll get more on that as we get in the materials. But again, this is just laying out some background for you. So Judaism under the Romans, there are pretty much two questions. I'm going to simplify it. It's a complex kind of mess at this time in the first century Roman Empire. Again, the reason I'm talking about Judaism is because everybody that's going to be a part of that Christian movement, or what will become the Christian movement from that first into the second century, the great majority of folks that we get, especially in those early years, they're Jewish, and they're bringing with them the history, the political ideas, the religious symbolism and understanding. And so, yeah, we got to wrap ourselves around it. So here are the two big questions that caused a lot of tension for those Jews in Palestine under Roman Empire. Again, remember, there's about 6 million Jews according to Roman census data, first century. 5 million are outside of Palestine, about 1 million are inside Palestine. And in Palestine, remember, that's also the area that Jesus will be born. It's a fairly military occupied state. And if I go back to this map, let me go back just really quickly for you. I'm going to blow this up. Okay, so Palestine, guys, is kind of like in this area right here. All right. So when you're thinking about this, those of you that are my strategic thinkers, this is a pretty important area you can think of in terms of strategic, in terms of economic, military, right, transportation. You're going to want to hold this whole area right here. And it also gives you, it's a connector area too between this northern part of the empire and then towards Egypt in this southern area. Okay, so going back to our little piece here, there's a reason that it's a military occupied area. It's never treated like just a general state of the empire. It stays with a military governor. So the two big questions, however, are, why don't we have the full blessings of God back? So there's this ongoing desire, and we've been around this before. This is why the Exodus materials are so important, and the Torah text. But this is also where those questions that we took our time with in the prophetic material are bearing out. Why don't we have those full blessings of God back? What does it mean that we are no longer sovereign under our own king? We have the law in so much as the Torah. The temple has now being rebuilt, but the Romans, and prior to the Romans, it was the Greeks, and prior to the Greeks, it was the Persians, and prior to the Persians, it's the Babylonian. Right? Right? We're just going through this, but we're still an occupied area. And then, of course, the other question, which we set you up, we did really well to understand in the prophetic literature, especially when we have this experience of the exile and the diaspora. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it then, if I don't have these external signs that are so much a part of our covenantal identity and this core relationship with Yahweh, what then does it mean to be a Jew? And so one of the big questions that many Jews, because remember, we still have 5 million that are outside of Palestine, all throughout the empire, do we assimilate? And if so, what are the things that we assimilate on? So that could be like language, that could be like some social practices, marriage. You may have different Jews practice looking at marital rights very differently. And then, and what things do we resist? So, do we resist in keeping the Sabbath holy? Do we resist in the Torah observations on what we eat and what we wear, and how we treat other people like employees or neighbors or things like that? One of the ways I would say is a great analogy is if you know families or you yourself have ever traveled and you were spending a great not just like a tourist, but you were actually spending some kind of time in this other country where your language, your name, everything about you might be a minority. What are the things that you hold on to, those things that you say, this is not something I'm willing to give away, this is core to my identity? And then of course those things you're willing to assimilate to. And I think it's interesting because people are still doing this in 2022. You may even have friends here at Catholic whose families have moved here either temporarily or maybe are immigrating here, and they may change their name to be a name that seems a little more Americanized. That's becoming less of a tradition, where maybe 50 years ago or even 100 years ago, people would do that as a way to try to fit in and signal to the majority culture that, hey, we're part of your family or your community now. But you still maybe see things that what they hold on to. So like if you've ever been to Kroger or Food City and you see what they sometimes call ethnic food aisles, you may notice in different parts of the city and different grocery stores a predominance of certain kinds of ethnic foods. So there may be a larger kosher section, or there may be a larger um, Asian food section or Indian food section in certain parts of our communities, like stores that are located in certain communities because they are a business and they want to sell people stuff to make money. They may carry a larger selection if they know that that's a demand in their community. So this may be a way that people still maintain their identity by observing certain food practices, like kosher, which would be associated with Judaism as both a religious as well as a cultural practice. Okay, so that question is right there. And it's also going to come up in the New Testament materials, particularly for Christians, in terms of, well, what does it mean to be a Christian? And this is where sometimes you get Paul's Paul answering some really practical questions of things like, is it okay to eat food that's been sacrificed at the temple of the gods, like that happens in Corinthians? We'll go through that, but that is an example. I mean, it's sort of where the rubber hits the road in terms of the day-to-day choices that people make in their practice. Okay, moving right along. Well, prior to about 200 years to the New Testament is written, the Jews in Israel do have a revolt. And I want to be clear, this is in the background even at Jesus's time. This is why that area of the world that Jesus is born into is a military occupied state. So that area prior to Rome was under Greek rule, and there was a Greek king that supposedly sacrificed a pig in the temple, right? Or that's the rumor. And of course, this breaks so many sacred. It's a sacrilegious act, right? In so many ways. So the result of this supposed moment or event was a revolution, and uh, the Jewish dynasty last for about 100 years. They actually gained their footing against the Seleucids, or these Greek uh, kings, and then they are able to hold on to the temple and to some aspect of sovereignty, but they are conquered when the Romans show up, right? It's always the Romans. And though it had been over 100 years by the time Jesus is around, the Jews have that memory. I mean, I want you to think about, like, even in our own history here in East Tennessee, there are so many markers and layers to the history of our own place and our own time. And as someone that, I will be frank, I'm not from around here. I claim this as my home now, but I've only been here just now a decade. And I can observe that there are layers to the history, everything from immigration history and many different immigrant communities. There's religious history here, including indigenous communities, Christian communities. Our own Catholic history here has a really unique place. There have been war histories here, including the Civil War, has a really interesting place here in Knoxville. And you can see it, especially as an outsider, all these various layers. The memories don't go. And so these Jews are remembering this short little period of time where they had some semblance of that sovereignty, that marker of their covenantal relationship with God. And they remember this time that they were free. So things are always kind of uneasy and quite tense in Palestine. So there are three groups that kind of really show up in the New Testament. Let me be clear, this is not representative of all the kinds of Jews that are there. The variety are a little bit more complicated. But for our purposes, because we're doing quite a kind of intro level kind of work, we're just going to focus on these three because they're the ones mentioned the most in the New Testament. And if you get to go to a university and you get to take a class on the intro to the New Testament, they'll probably show up at least the most predominantly, and your professor will definitely go into much deeper stuff with it. But I just want to give you just sort of, again, this is laying some foundation stuff for you. The first group is probably one you've heard quite a bit. They are the most named group in New Testament literature. These are the Pharisees, and they resist Roman law and Roman rule. They emphasize keeping the law. So if you think about most of the time that you hear them in terms of their context with Jesus, they're like quoting the law or the Torah back to Jesus. Sorry about that. My friend is texting me about her collie. Okay. And then you have the Sadducees who adapted to Roman rule. So their assimilation is a little bit different, but they do focus on the temple. They tended to be educated. They tended to have some kind of a little bit more wealth and established because they are working with the government and the government officials. This is what in the New Testament, the rich young ruler is considered to be a Sadducee as in scholarship. And then you have the Essenes. The Essenes represent a kind of really unique group. They are preparing for the kind of end times. If you've ever seen like the National Enquirer or any of these sort of magazines, I remember them when I would shop with my grandmother and my mother and father. And they would have like Nicodemus predicts who's going to win the Super Bowl or something like that. And sometimes this was my first introduction to these, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then while I was at Marquette, I got to take a course with Dr. Deidre Dempsey, who has done some major work, including doing digs on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And most people who have done that work talk about the Dead Sea Scroll community. Most of the kind of body of scholarship for this locates this as a group of Jews known as the Essenes. And they were preparing for the return of the Messiah. And so there's a lot of interesting materials around that. What's important here is that this is a group that withdraws to the desert. They reject civilization, they reject the city and the urban dwelling, and they're planning for spiritual warfare. And for those of you that are thinking of all the kinds of communities, both Jewish and Christian, or even Islamic, yeah, this stuff, right? It's old. This, it's not a new idea. And there's lots of really cool things. And I hope you take advanced work in your colleges, whether you're at a public university or a private university. If you get the opportunity, this stuff is really cool because I think it gives you a lot of insights to modern religion and a realization that some of the concepts are just kind of baked in and built into how we think about ourselves. But yeah, this is a group that was really waiting for the kind of end times to happen. They had a very much apocalyptic view of how things were going to happen. All right. So my point for you in all of this is to talk about what we call the Jewish New Testament. One of the things I want you, and the reason I took such a long time, we took our sweet, sweet time getting through the Hebrew Bible, is that there's a lot of influence of the Hebrew materials in these New Testament sacred scriptures. And you can see the influence of these three sects in the New Testament. From the Pharisees, you're going to get an emphasis on law keeping and the work of interpreting the law. If you have ever sat through an ethics course in Christianity, if you have ever maybe even done a confirmation class, or you've had a professor or teacher who talks about the law in morality or something like that, they're actually using a pretty old construction here about the importance of law. And when they talk about law, even in our catechism, in the Life of Christ section about morality, it's big L law. And that's coming from the Mosaic covenant. And that the idea, remember, the Judaic idea of the commandments is not rules, right? These are spoken words. This is an act of life giving in the same way that they understand the act of life giving when God speaks the world or universe into being. So I think in English, and I also think just there are forms or veins of Christianity, we've kind of lost that sensibility. But if you were to pick up rabbinical literature, or you look at rabbinical history or commentaries on the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue, you'll get that sensibility pretty fast. So the concept here that they're working through is that the law is living and it's evolving as a Christian practice. This is so important when we're talking about Paul, right? Because Paul has to take that great commandment. Now remember, we start in the Hebrew Bible with the Decalogue, the 10 commandments, deca meaning 10 words that are spoken, but there's 613 mitzvah in the Torah. That's 613 commandments, these ways of living, of being a kind of person. So when Jesus particularly gets to the Beatitudes, he's pulling all of those things forward. And the argument that Jesus is making about this being a way of life and a way of living, right, is so important. So important for what he's doing there. Okay, let me close that. All right. The Sadducees, there's definitely an idea of strict law maintaining, but the idea that you're getting from them is that the lived experience of one's religious identity is expressed by one's keeping of the law. So the law is getting here, like, this is where you kind of get the how well you do things, how well you maintain those mitzvah is how you are known in terms of your religious identity. This is pretty influential. I mean, we have versions of Christianity in which that's a really important understanding about how we identify as Christian. Like, and we see it even in our own Catholic tradition. It's not, this is not to cast a judgment. It's neither good nor bad. But it is a sensibility about how one's identity is formed. And then finally, you got the apocalyptic vision, right? So that one is a really interesting one because this one looks at the Christian experience, right, as expressed as both in literature, such as the book of Revelations, as well as in Christian practice. It has this apocalyptic. Now, remember the difference between apocalyptic and eschatology. Apocalyptic is the inbreaking of heaven. It's the inbreaking of God into human time and into human history. Eschatology is how the end game works out, what the end times look like. You can have a text, and I have Book of Revelations here. And here's what I'd like for you to do. You can have a text, I meant to say, that it can be both apocalyptic and eschatological. But you can have texts that are one or the other. From the Essenes, we definitely get a strong sense of this now, not yet is probably a really great one that Paul kind of bridges those two things together with. So here's what I'd like for you to do without me. I'd like for you to pull up Matthew 23. So if you could pull up Matthew 23, and then in the next few moments, I'd like for you to read through that. And then I would like for you, as you read through Matthew 23, and have this answer ready for me when I get back, which one do you think is happening there? Which of these three influences is behind Matthew 23? And we're going to talk about that when I see you next. Okay, one last bit before we go. Let's see if I can pull up the next one. I wanted to do just a little bit, not the full slide presentation here. See if it loads. Again, make sure that you're pausing anytime that you need to do the notes. Get that onto full screen for everybody. My internet's moving a little slow. Okay. All right. Hopefully. Okay. Well, that just went out. Just give me a second here, guys. My Prezi shut off, so just like we're in class, right? And we're dealing with B building Wi-Fi. Let me try here. You can fast forward right through all this. Here we go. Let's try this again. Okay. And we're buffering. All right. Let me make this a little less messy. Okay. I just want to go back again and just kind of reemphasize some of this. So hopefully you're back from Matthew 23. For this slide, definitely you kind of want to make sure you have this information down. Judaism, one of the things I want to say, because this will help you understand what's going on in some of the inner dialogue that is happening between the apostles and Jesus, and even with Paul. The biggest mistake that people make when they're reading these materials is they think of the Judaism as just sort of this unilateral, uniform version. If you can think of right now, how many versions of Christianity, if we, as my granny might have said, Granny Segraves might have said, if we took a dead cat and swung it by his tail, right, in a 5-mile radius of Catholic high school, how many different churches, Christian churches, would we hit? And what that silly, goofy expression is there to say is there's a kind of diversity that exists in Christianity. And so remember, we have got a really big population of Judaism, a pretty dense one in the Roman Empire, and it is anything but uniform. There's a spectrum of Judaism, just like you would expect to find even in Judaism in 2022 here in Tennessee or in the United States. So there, however, with all that diversity, two things remain central to Hebrew identity and what it means to be a Jew, even in first century Roman Empire. The first is the Torah, which we've been on for a minute, and the second is the temple. These are the two big signs. So please, please make sure that you have that in your notes and that you understand that piece. All right. The other thing about the diversity, which plays into so many of these arguments, I'm going to say this, you don't have to write that big paragraph there. In fact, you don't have to do this slide. You can just take a break here and just listen. I just want to just give you some of this. I'm never going to test you on any of these kinds of things. I just want you to know. One, the Hellenistic culture. Greek culture is huge. And you do have, as we've just talked about, you have Jews and that have adapted to that culture. Remember that the New Testament materials are written in Greek. They're written in a version called Koine Greek, which is a kind of common Greek. As much as I can do this for you, I will give you some Greek material just to show you the beauty of the text and the language that these materials are written in. But that's an example of that culture. And then you have a political hegemony, and all my government folks, with this, it just, again, we've got all kinds of like ways that we can talk about that and what that looks like. But the reality for us is that there's a connection between the religious and national visions in Judaism. This is going to give rise to people that are looking for like a David 2.0 in the Messiah, to people who see this like what we were talking about with the apocalyptic, like the restoration of the Israel being this massive, like heavenly, otherworldly event. You just got the gamut of those things, but what they share is that the national identity, your ethnic identity, and your religious identity are kind of wound up together. So the point of all this is there's a lot of pluralism within the Judaic faith. It reveals itself in the New Testament. It reveals itself in those parables, it reveals itself in the Pauline works. There's divisions in the priesthood, tensions between Rome and so it's just, boy, there's drama. This is why you got to study the Bible. There's just so much good drama and you never get tired of it. All right. So this one you do want to write down. So Greek culture was both welcome and rejected by Jewish communities, because remember, the Greeks conquered Israel before the Romans. And so the Greek culture is going to hold there. On one hand, you get infrastructure, you get stability, you get educational practices like logic and philosophy. Those of you that are going to go on and do a world history course, this is where you start to see like Alexandria and all the great libraries. And there's some incredibly important Jewish philosophical thinkers, and then later some really important Christian thinkers that are deeply influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek ways of thinking and history. There's my cat who just fluffed her tail by. But the other Greek culture presented some challenges, and one of those challenges was how culture should be constructed. I mean, a modern way of this is, you know, a lot of times Catholics or Christians will talk about, like, what does it mean to be a Christian in the public square? Like, what does my life look like as a Christian participating as an American citizen? Like, are there moments that there are things that are in conflict about that? Right. And of course we recognize that. So, you know, for one of those things that's important is for Roman Catholics, certainly we observe the March for Life. We use the American protected right to protest a law. We seek to change that law because the way that as Catholics we understand that is that it is against an essential teaching, and that we rank that teaching above what our country or our nation has identified as a good. We say the greater good is the kingdom of God in this, where all human life is protected. So that's an example where there can be challenges. So you can imagine at a festival when you have to pay homage to a god or something like that as part of your participation in a community, you may feel some kind of conflict about that. So governance comes up quite a bit. So Messianism, Torah, and the temple and the synagogue. I cannot express to you how important these synagogues are. By the time we're here in this first century, the synagogues network is really sophisticated and highly developed, so that when we lose the temple, and if you remember from this slide, we're going to lose the temple in 70 CE. The Romans will destroy it for the second and the last time. So 2 times the temple is destroyed, first by the Babylonians in 586, and then 70 CE, so 586 BCE, and then they're allowed to rebuild it. It will stand for several centuries, and then in 70 CE, following a small revolt, the Romans will demolish the temple for the second and the last time in 70 CE. Okay, then the synagogue rises into importance when the temple is gone. And we see that in the New Testament. Think about all the times that we're reading through Paul and he's in a synagogue preaching or talking to people. So that's fairly important. All right, I'm gonna just skip right through this one. Don't worry about that. I'll talk about that when we get there someday. And here's the last thing I want to say is the rabbinic tradition. There is a dominance in this time of the Pharisaic movement. There is a reason that you are seeing in the New Testament, the Pharisees kind of is the dominant group. And then when the temple is finally destroyed for the second time, you start to see this kind of emergence of their prominence. The other thing I want to say is that don't forget that even though we've got some written stuff, we do have the oral tradition is alive, well, in the dominant force that it's moving through and how we have these sources. This includes our New Testament materials as well. Okay. And then we've done this one. The only thing I really, really, really want to do with you is synagogue. Remember, I opened up this whole year and we did a video of a synagogue, a modern synagogue for you. And with especially the destruction of the temple, the synagogues are going to increase in prominence. And then for those Jews that are in exile, remember, if you are one of those 5 million Jews and you're in the most northern part or southernmost southern part of the empire, getting back to Jerusalem to the temple is not a reality. Maybe once in your lifetime, or a couple times in your lifetime, depending on your status. But the ability to do that is just overwhelming. So what forms in the synagogues then are rituals and traditions that try to mirror the temple rites. So, for example, daily prayers 3 times a day that correspond to the sacrifice times at the temple. That's an example of those as things. And those things can travel no matter where you are in the world. You can gather with someone to study and read the Torah, to uh, mind those prayers at those times a day, right? But the focus there is on the Torah, and with the focus on the Torah are the rabbis, right, who are the teachers. So between prayer and learning and identity, the synagogue is really important to forming the bulk of Jewish identity outside of the temple area or the Palestinian area. Okay, that's it for us on this material. We will continue. I'm going to open up. We're going to start with one of our first gospels when I see you next. Please make sure you have all of these notes down in your notebook. If you're typing these, you'll definitely want to make sure you bring a hard copy. We will have an IDQ on these materials one of the first days that I get back, that I see you. So I'm hoping to do it at the end of this week. If not, it'll be the first of next week. So please, please make sure you have these notes. I miss you guys. I will see you Thursday. I think you're in my rotation. So, and again, please keep us in your prayers as we travel. If you have any questions at all, shoot me a note in Teams. And I will see you when I see you, gang. All right. Bye-bye.